how does transnational crime impact Latin American nations, particularly in terms of the costs? How is it affecting society, politics, and the economy, and the prospects for development? Daniel, why don't we begin with you?
Okay, I'll start with corruption. There is an author in Colombia, a historian, I guess, which said that it was politicians who corrupted drug traffickers in Colombia. And it's actually the case. It was politicians who attempted to convince Pablo Escobar to run for Congress. It was not Pablo Escobar who tried to run for Congress, but politicians who approached him, the Liberal Party actually, who approached him to run for Congress. So corruption, I guess the Colombian history and the history of other countries in Latin America, Mexico now, Central America is full of stories of direct links between drug trafficking organizations and politicians. And in terms of the cost of conflict and the cost of combating these organizations, I guess the difference between what would be the standard measure of violence in Latin America, and I think that the extra violence that we have in Latin America is all explained by drug trafficking. In Colombia, the homicide rate, the part of the homicide rate that is explained by drug trafficking is about 25% of Colombian. The Colombian homicide rate is explained by drug trafficking. If you actually subtract the 25% of the Colombian homicide rate, you would get the average Latin American homicide rate. So I guess the economic costs of having large criminal organizations shouldn't be counted only as the extra amount of military spending, but also on the cost imposed to the economy for having these large levels of violence compared to other countries in the region.
Thank you. Steve, João, anything to add?
I think there's one thing that is inescapable for the producer countries and the transit countries, that most of the costs of combating drug trafficking has been shifted to those countries. I think most of the strategy has been a supply reduction strategy that is very costly for the producers and the transit countries. Of course, there are many aspects of the strategy that could be demand reducing. We're going to talk about that, but I think we should start as a starting point. I think we should start recognizing that. I think that Daniel used you used this great analogy once that suppose that we shifted all the demand for cocaine to Canada. Would the United States tolerate the amount of violence that there was in Tijuana to take place in Seattle, for instance? I think that's one way to think about how the costs have been shifted to producer and transit countries. And Daniel has touched this issue, but I wanted to elaborate a little bit on it. There is a suspicion about Latin American exceptionalism in crime. That means we run regressions, and the residual for Latin America is always, it appears to be really high. So if we throw in inequality, income, poverty, measures, like fluffy measures, but they capture something like rule of law, we cannot explain Latin Americans' crime rate. When you actually break it down by country, you can explain Brazil, you can explain Argentina, you can explain many countries. Those are pushing up the residuals are the producer and the transit countries, which is a big suggestion that what is causing most of the Latin American exceptionalism, when you look at it in the aggregates, is the fact that Latin America is a big producer and wholesale distributor of narcotics.
Very interesting.
I would just say that, I mean, of course, I'm not going to deny the perverse impact of drug trafficking and other organized crime activities, but the portfolios of those who we've studied, the criminal groups that we've studied, are incredibly diverse. one aspect of what they do, and normally their original capital accumulation starts maybe with cattle rustling, maybe moves to some sort of contraband or some sort of idea like that, and then moves gradually towards drug trafficking. When they reach drug trafficking status, they probably already have cattle businesses and other businesses operating, and they end up generating quite a bit of business activity in the areas in which they operate. So I have to think that we have to include this in our analysis. We can't just simply talk about the costs all the time without also talking about the people who are receiving direct benefits from this. And you see this when these people get extradited or when they get arrested. There are normally large marches and things of that sort because people have lost their jobs. The businesses have been confiscated, etc. So I'd like us to consider that as well when we're talking about this issue.